The red dust of Ajabamidil village swirled in the harmattan wind as 15-year-old Adunni balanced a clay pot of water on her head. The morning sun cast long shadows between the mud brick houses, each one adorned with intricate patterns painted by the women during the dry season. Children's laughter echoed from the marketplace, but underneath the normal sounds of village life lay an undercurrent of fear that had settled over their community like a heavy blanket. For 3 moons now, children had been disappearing from neighboring villages. First, it was young Kemi from Oganoja, then twin boys from Alife, and most recently, a girl no older than Adunni from the village just beyond the cassava farms. The elders spoke in hushed tones about strangers who came in the night, about vehicles that roared through darkness, and about families left weeping for children who vanished like morning mist. Adunni's grandmother, Mama Agba, had grown increasingly protective, rarely allowed her to venture beyond the village boundaries that had once felt like gentle suggestions rather than firm rules. As Adunni approached their small compound, she noticed how the other villagers' eyes followed her movements. She was growing into a beautiful young woman, with skin the color of rich kola nut and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. These same qualities that made her grandmother proud also made her a target in these dangerous times, though Adunni herself remained blissfully unaware of the attention her blossoming beauty attracted from those with dark intentions. Later that afternoon, restless energy coursed through Adunni's veins like palm wine. The compound felt suffocating, and the usual activities that occupied her time, helping with the cooking, weaving baskets, and listening to the women's gossip, held no appeal. She glanced toward the forest path that led to the old Irako tree, where she often went to think and dream. Mama Agbo was deep in conversation with other elders about the upcoming harvest festival, their voices a constant drone of Yoruba mixed with English. Without a word, Adunni slipped away from the compound, her bare feet silent on the well-worn path. The forest welcomed her with its familiar embrace of green shadows and bird songs. She had walked this route countless times since childhood, collecting firewood, picking wild fruits, and sometimes just sitting beneath the ancient Irako tree to escape the noise and responsibilities of village life. The tree was said to be older than the village itself, its massive trunk requiring 20 people holding hands to encircle it completely. But as she ventured deeper into the forest than usual, drawn by the sight of beautiful yellow flowers blooming on a distant tree, a sound stopped her in her tracks. Deep, rhythmic drum beats echoed through the forest, though she could see no drummer. The sound was both familiar and strange, like the talking drums used during festivals, but somehow more urgent, more warning. The beats seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, making her heart race with inexplicable fear. Without understanding why, Adunni turned and ran back toward the village, the mysterious drum beats following her until she reached the safety of her grandmother's compound. Mama Agba took one look at Adunni's frightened face and set down her mortar and pestle with a heavy thud. The old woman's weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and countless stories, reached for her granddaughter's trembling shoulders. Her eyes, though clouded with age, seemed to see far more than what stood before her. The other women in the compound fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment as Mama Agba guided Adunni to the wooden stool beside the cooking fire. "What did you hear, my child?" Mama Agba asked in Yoruba, her voice carrying the gentle firmness that had guided Adunni through 15 years of life. When Adunni described the drums, her grandmother's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, a recognition that made her seem to age before Adunni's eyes. The old woman nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had long expected but hoped would never come to pass. "Those drums," Mama Agba whispered, "they are not meant for everyone to hear." She glanced toward the forest, then back at her granddaughter with eyes that held secrets older than the village itself. "Tomorrow, when the sun is high and the shadows are short, we will talk. Tonight, you stay close to home, and you do not venture beyond the compound walls." Her tone brooked no argument, and Adunni, still shaken by her experience, nodded obediently. But as she lay on her sleeping mat that night, the rhythmic drum beats echoed in her memory, and she wondered what her grandmother knew that she was not yet ready to share. The next morning found Adunni and Mama Agba sitting beneath the old mango tree in their compound, away from curious ears and busy hands. The market sounds drifted over the compound walls. Traders calling their wares, children playing, and the constant hum of village life. But within their small circle of shade, time seemed suspended as Mama Agba prepared to reveal truths that had been carefully guarded for years. Your mother, Folake, was the most beautiful woman in 5 villages, Mama Agba began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a traditional storyteller. She could make the rain dance with her laughter and cause the strongest men to forget their own names with just a smile. But her greatest gift was not her beauty. It was her ability to sense danger, to feel in her bones when evil approached our village. Adunni listened with growing amazement, hungry for any details about the mother she had never known, who had died bringing her into the world. When Folake was carrying you, the old woman continued, strange men began appearing in the neighboring villages. They spoke of opportunities in the big cities, of jobs for young women, of education and money for poor families. But Folake's heart beat warnings like a drum whenever these men came near. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would protect you with my life and teach you to listen to the voices that speak through the ancestral realm. Mama Agba paused, watching a butterfly land on the mango leaves above them. The drums you heard yesterday, those are your mother's hands, called from the spirit world to warn you of danger approaching. Market day in Ajabamidil was always a celebration of colors, sounds, and smells that made the village come alive with energy. Adunni walked beside Mama Agba through the maze of stalls, admiring the bright Ankara fabrics, inhaling the aroma of roasted plantains and spicy suya, and listening to the musical arguments between traders and customers. Her grandmother had agreed to this outing only after extracting promises that Adunni would stay within sight at all times and return home before the sun reached its peak. At the yam seller stall, while Mama Agba haggled over prices with her usual theatrical flair, Adunni noticed 2 men watching her from across the narrow market lane. They were not from the village. Their clothes were too fine, their skin too soft, their eyes too calculating, as they assessed her like farmers evaluating livestock. One whispered something to the other, who nodded and began moving closer, his smile too wide and too practiced to be genuine. "Sister, you are very beautiful," the approaching man said in English, his voice smooth as palm oil but somehow making Adunni's skin crawl. "My friend and I, we work for an agency in Lagos. We help pretty girls like you find good jobs, make money to help your family. You interested?" But even as he spoke, Adunni felt a familiar sensation building in her chest, the same inexplicable fear she had experienced in the forest. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the market noise, she heard the faint echo of drumbeats, her mother's warning, calling her away from danger that wore a friendly face and spoke of opportunities too good to be true. Without fully understanding why, Adunni stepped backward toward her grandmother, her heart hammering in rhythm with the ghostly drums that only she could hear. The man's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew harder as he noticed her retreat. "Don't be shy, sister," he said, reaching out as if to touch her arm. "We just want to talk. Maybe buy you some meat pie. Discuss your future." His companion had circled around behind them, cutting off easy escape routes through the crowded market. "Adunni!" Mama Agba's sharp voice cut to the man's honeyed words like a machete through tall grass. The old woman appeared at her granddaughter's side with surprising speed, her walking stick raised and her eyes blazing with protective fury. "Who are you men, and why are you speaking to my granddaughter?" The entire market seemed to pause as other villagers turned to witness the confrontation, their faces reflecting the growing suspicion that had infected all their communities. The 2 strangers exchanged glances, their friendly masks slipping slightly as they realized they had attracted unwanted attention. "Just offering the girl opportunities, Mama," the first man said, but he was already backing away, melting into the crowd with practiced ease. "Think about what I said, beautiful girl. We will be around." As they disappeared, Adunni felt the drumbeats fade, but their warning echoed in her mind long after market sounds returned to normal. Mama Agba's grip on her arm was firm as they hurried home, the old woman's prayers mixing Yoruba and English in desperate pleas for protection from the ancestors and the Christian God alike. That evening, the sound of the talking drums summoned the adults of Ajabamidil to an emergency meeting beneath the ancient Irako tree at the village center. Adunni watched from the shadows as her grandmother joined the circle of elders, their faces grave in the flickering light of palm oil lamps. The village head, Baba Luko, spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of leadership and growing desperation as he described similar encounters in neighboring communities. "The strangers are becoming bolder," he announced, his white agbada rustling in the evening breeze. "Yesterday, 3 girls were taken from Iwoy village. Their families found only tire tracks and the smell of exhaust where their daughters had been playing." Murmurs of fear rippled to the gathered villagers as mothers unconsciously drew their children closer, and Father's hands moved to the machetes at their sides. Mama Agba rose slowly, her voice cutting through the worried conversations. "We must organize watches, especially during market days. No child should be alone, and strangers must be questioned immediately." Other elders nodded agreement, but Adunni could see the helplessness in their faces. They were farmers and traders, not warriors, and their traditional ways offered little protection against modern predators who use vehicles and false promises instead of spears and war cries. As the meeting continued, Adunni retreated to her sleeping mat, but sleep eluded her as she listened to the worried voices of her community and wondered how her mother's spirit could protect her against dangers that seemed too large for any one village to face. 3 days passed without incident, and life in Ajabamidil began to settle into a new rhythm of cautious normalcy. Adunni helped with the daily chores, attended the morning prayers led by Pastor Emmanuel at the small church, and listened to her grandmother's stories with new appreciation for their hidden meanings. But on the 4th day, restlessness seized her again, stronger than before, as if her mother's spirit was calling her to test the strength of their supernatural connection. The path to the stream where the village women washed clothes had always been considered safe, lie within the accepted boundaries of village territory. Adunni convinced herself that carrying the family's laundry there would not violate her grandmother's protective restrictions. The morning sun filtered through the forest canopy as she balanced a bundle of clothes on her head, following the familiar route that dozens of women had walked for generations. But halfway to the stream, she realized she was not alone on the path. Behind her, she could hear footsteps that stopped when she stopped and resumed when she walked. When she glanced over her shoulder, she glimpsed a figure ducking behind the trees. Too far away to identify clearly, but close enough to make her skin prickle with alarm. As fear began to build in her chest, the drumbeats started again, urgent and insistent, seeming to come from the very air around her. This time, she didn't hesitate. Abandoning the laundry, she ran toward home as fast as her legs could carry her, the ghostly drums beating a rhythm of protection until she reached the safety of her grandmother's compound. Mama Agba listened to Adunni's breathless account of being followed, with a mixture of pride and concern that played across her weathered features like shadows on water. "Your mother's protection is strong," she said, pulling her granddaughter close, "but you must learn to trust it completely. The drums are not just warnings, they are guidance. When you hear them, you must not question or hesitate. Your life may depend on your obedience to their call." That afternoon, the old woman led Adunni to a small shrine hidden behind their compound, where a wooden carving of a woman holding drums sat surrounded by kola nuts, palm wine, and fresh flowers. "This is your mother," Mama Agba explained, kneeling despite her arthritic joints. "Every week since you were born, I have come here to ask for her protection and to tell her of your growth and achievements. She watches over you always, but the connection grows stronger as you become a woman. Can I speak to her?" Adunni asked, kneeling beside her grandmother and staring at the carved face that bore resemblance to her own features. Mama Agba nodded and began a prayer in Yoruba, her voice rising and falling like music as she spoke to the spirit world. Adunni found herself adding her own silent words, thanking her mother for protection and asking for continued guidance. As if in response, a gentle breeze stirred the flowers around the shrine, and somewhere in the distance, very faintly, she heard the soft whisper of drums carrying on the wind. The upcoming harvest festival brought a temporary lightness to Ajabamidil as the women began preparing elaborate costumes, and the men practiced traditional dances they would perform to honor the gods of agriculture. Adunni threw herself into the preparations, helping to sew beads onto the dancers' costumes and learning the songs that would accompany the ceremonies. For a few precious days, The fear that had gripped the village seemed to retreat as the community focused on celebration and gratitude for another successful growing season. Mama Agba had promised that Adunni could participate in the festival's opening ceremony, where unmarried girls danced to bless the harvest and pray for good husbands. It would be Adunni's first time joining this sacred dance, marking her transition from child to young woman in the eyes of the community. The thought filled her with excitement and nervousness in equal measure as she practiced the intricate steps that had been passed down through generations of village women. But on the day before the festival, as Adunni was returning from the final dance rehearsal, she noticed strange vehicles parked along the main road that led through their village. The cars were too expensive for anyone from the local area, their windows tinted dark against curious eyes. Several villagers had gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves and pointing at the unfamiliar automobiles. As Adunni approached her compound, she felt the familiar tingle of awareness that preceded her mother's warnings, and sure enough, the faint sound of drums began to echo in her ears, urgent and insistent, as if her mother's spirit was trying to tell her that the festival would bring more than celebration to their peaceful village. Sleep refused to come to Adunni that night as the drum beats continued their ghostly rhythm in her mind, sometimes fading to whispers, sometimes growing urgent enough to make her sit up in alarm. Through the thin walls of their mud brick house, she could hear Mama Agba moving restlessly on her own sleeping mat, muttering prayers and incantations in the darkness. The old woman's anxiety was palpable, filling their small rooms like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Near midnight, voices outside their compound walls made both women freeze in silence. Men were speaking in low tones, their words too quiet to understand, but their intent somehow sinister in the darkness. Adunni heard the sound of footsteps circling their property, pausing at the gate, then moving on. Her mother's drums beat faster in her ears, and she pressed her face against a small window to peer out into the night, but saw only shadows moving between the buildings. "They are counting," Mama Agbo whispered from across the room, her voice barely audible. "Counting how many girls, how many families, how many ways to enter and escape." The old woman rose and lit a small lamp, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls as she moved to her shrine, and began praying with desperate intensity. "Your mother's spirit is restless tonight," she told Adunni. "She knows what tomorrow may bring. We must trust in her protection and be ready to run if the drums call us to safety." Outside, the voices faded into the distance, but the sense of impending danger remained thick in the air like the promise of a storm. The harvest festival began before dawn with the traditional horn blowing that echoed across the village, calling everyone to gather in the central square. Despite the undercurrent of fear that had plagued their community, the villagers came dressed in their finest clothes, determined to honor the ancestors and celebrate their blessings. Adunni wore a beautiful blue and gold wrapper that had belonged to her mother, with matching beads that caught the early morning light like captured stars. The ceremonies proceeded as they had for countless generations. Prayers to the gods of the harvest, presentations of the season's first fruits, and dances that told the stories of their ancestors' relationship with the land. But Adunni noticed how the men's eyes constantly scanned the edges of the celebration, watching for strangers, and how the women kept their daughters closer than usual. The drum beats of the festival musicians could not drown out the ghostly rhythm that only she could hear, growing more insistent as the morning progressed. When the time came for the unmarried girls' dance, Adunni joined the circle with 11 other young women, their movements graceful and synchronized as they honored the spirits of fertility and abundance. But as they danced, she spotted unfamiliar faces among the crowd, men who were not from any of the surrounding villages, their eyes following the dancers with predatory intensity. Her mother's drums reached a crescendo in her mind, and she stumbled slightly in the dance, her heart racing with the certainty that the festival was providing exactly the opportunity their enemies had been waiting for. As the girls' dance concluded to enthusiastic applause, Adunni felt her mother's spiritual presence stronger than ever before, the drum beats now accompanied by what seemed like whispered warnings in a voice she had never heard but somehow recognized. The sensation was so powerful that she nearly cried out, her hand flying to her chest as if to calm her racing heart. Mama Agba, watching from the crowd, seemed to sense her granddaughter's distress and began moving toward her. But before the old woman could reach her, one of the strange men approached the dancing circle, his smile friendly but his eyes cold as winter rain. "Beautiful dancing sisters," he called out in English, his voice carrying clearly over the festival noise. "My friends and I, we are talent scouts from Lagos. We are looking for girls like you to join our entertainment company. Good money, nice houses, travel to big cities." Several of the younger dancers looked interested, their faces lighting up at the mention of opportunities beyond their rural village. The drum beats in Adunni's head became thunderous, and suddenly she could see her mother standing behind the stranger, her spirit form translucent but unmistakable, her hands moving frantically in the universal gesture of warning. Without thinking, Adunni grabbed the arm of the girl standing nearest to her and shouted, "Run! Everyone run now!" Her voice, amplified by panic and supernatural awareness, cut through the festival atmosphere like a blade. The musicians stopped playing, the crowd fell silent, and in that moment of shocked stillness, everyone could see what Adunni had already sensed: more strangers emerging from the edges of the celebration, moving with coordinated purpose toward the group of young dancers. Chaos erupted in the village square as Adunni's warning triggered immediate action from the adults who had been watching the strangers with growing suspicion. Fathers rushed toward their daughters, while mothers screamed names and directions. The visiting predators, realizing their plan had been exposed, abandoned all pretense of friendliness and began grabbing for any girls within reach, their practiced movements revealing that this was not their first such operation. Adunni found herself separated from the other dancers in the panicking crowd, the ghostly drumbeats now guiding her movements as surely as if her mother's hands were physically pulling her to safety. She darted between festival stalls and around cooking fires, following an instinctive path that seemed to open before her, while closing behind her to confuse her pursuers. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps and angry voices as at least two of the strangers gave chase, their city shoes slipping on the dusty village paths. The drums led her toward the forest, to paths she knew better than any outsider could hope to follow. As she ran, she caught glimpses of other village girls being herded toward the vehicles, their families fighting desperately to reach them. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that her mother's protection extended only to her, and that other daughters might not be so fortunate. But the drumbeats urged her forward, promising that survival was her first responsibility, and that the living could only help others by remaining free themselves. The forest welcomed Adunni like an old friend, its familiar paths and hidden routes offering sanctuary from the chaos behind her. But her pursuers were persistent, their voices echoing to the trees as they crashed through undergrowth, following her trail with determination born of desperation. She could hear them getting closer, their breathing harsh with exertion, their curses growing more creative as branches caught their clothes and roots tripped their unfamiliar feet. The ghostly drums guided her deeper into the forest than she had ever ventured, to a grove of ancient trees where the air itself seemed thick with spiritual presence. Here, the canopy was so dense that midday felt like twilight, and the ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves that muffled all sound. As she paused to catch her breath, Adunni realized that her mother's drum beats had led her to sacred ground, a place where the ancestors dwelt and modern evil could not easily follow. Behind her, the sounds pursuit had stopped. Through the trees, she could see her two chasers standing at the edge of the grove, their faces pale with superstitious fear as they stared into the shadowy depths where she had disappeared. One made as if to follow, but his companion grabbed his arm, shaking his head and pointing back toward the village. "Leave her," she heard one of them say. "This place feels wrong. We got others." Their voices faded as they retreated, but Adunni remained in the grove, surrounded by the protective presence of generations of ancestors, her mother's drums now beating a gentle rhythm of reassurance and love. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Adunni finally emerged from the sacred grove to find Mama Agba waiting on the main path, her face streaked with tears of relief and worry. The old woman gathered her granddaughter into her arms, holding her close as if to ensure she was truly safe and unharmed. Around them, the forest was quiet except for the normal sounds of evening, birds settling into their roosts and small animals beginning their nightly activities. 3 girls were taken, Mama Agba whispered against Adunni's hair, her voice broken with grief for the families who would sleep incomplete that night. Kemi's younger sister, the blacksmith's daughter, and little Wunmi, who was visiting from Ogenoja. Their families are gathering now to plan rescue attempts, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew that once the predators reached the highways, the chances of successful pursuit by village men on foot became virtually impossible. As they walked home together through the gathering darkness, Adunni felt her mother's presence stronger than ever, the ghostly drums now beating a complex rhythm that seemed to carry messages of sorrow for the lost and determination for future. "Mama Agba," she said quietly, "I think my mother wants me to do something more than just run away. The drums, they're telling me that hiding isn't enough anymore." The old woman looked at her granddaughter with eyes that reflected both pride and fear, understanding that the girl she had raised was being called to a destiny larger and more dangerous than the simple life they had planned. That night, the remaining families of Ajabamidil gathered in the village square, their festival decorations now seeming like cruel mockeries of celebration in the lamplight. The village head spoke of organizing hunting parties to follow the kidnapper's trail, while the women wailed traditional songs of mourning for children who might never return home. But underneath the grief and anger, a new resolve was building, a determination that their community would not remain helpless victims. Adunni stood with her grandmother among the grieving families, watching as plans were made and strategies discussed. But the ghostly drumbeats in her mind were telling a different story, showing her visions of other villages, other festivals, other young girls who would face the same danger unless someone found a way to break the cycle. Her mother's spirit was no longer content with protecting just one daughter. She was calling for justice and prevention that could save countless others. "I have to go to the city," Adunni announced suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the square and causing conversations to halt mid-sentence. "My mother's spirit is showing me things, police stations, government offices, people who can help but don't know what's happening here." Mama Agba's hand tightened on her arm, but the old woman's eyes reflected understanding even as they filled with fresh tears. The village had approached them, his expression grave as he realized that their youngest member was proposing to undertake the most dangerous mission of all, leaving the safety of home to seek help from a world that had never shown much interest in the fate of rural children. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation as the village came together to support Adunni's unprecedented mission. The women contributed their savings to buy her city clothes and travel money, while the men shared what they knew of urban dangers and how to navigate government bureaucracy. Pastor Emmanuel provided her with letters of introduction to churches in Lagos, and the village head gave her official documentation of the kidnappings, complete with witness statements and descriptions of the perpetrators. Mama Agba spent hours teaching her granddaughter urban survival skills, how to recognize trustworthy people, how to avoid common scams, how to carry money safely, and most importantly, how to maintain her connection to her mother's spiritual guidance even in an environment that had forgotten the power of ancestral protection. They practiced different scenarios, with the old woman playing the roles of helpful officials, dangerous strangers, and indifferent bureaucrats that Adunni might encounter. On the final night before her departure, grandmother and granddaughter sat together at the family shrine, with a carved image of Folake seemed to glow in the lamplight. "Your mother was always meant for great things," Mama Agba whispered, placing fresh flowers and palm wine before the carving. "I thought her destiny died with her, but I see now that it was passed to you, waiting for the right moment to emerge." The drum beats that had guided and protected Adunni throughout her crisis now seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if her mother's spirit was eager to see justice served and protection extended to all the daughters who shared their vulnerable situation. The bus that would carry Adunni to Lagos arrived in a cloud of dust and diesel smoke, its colorful decorations and religious slogans providing cheerful contrast to the gravity of her mission. Half the village had gathered to see her off, pressing small gifts and final pieces of advice into her hands as she prepared to leave the only home she had ever known. Mama Agba stood proudly despite her tears, her blessing carrying the power of 3 generations of women who had survived against impossible odds. As the bus pulled away from Ajabamidil, Adunni pressed her face to the window, watching her village grow smaller until it disappeared entirely into the landscape of farms and forests. But even as the physical distance increased, she felt her connection to her mother's spirit growing stronger, the ghostly drumbeats now serving as a constant reminder of her purpose and a source of courage for the challenges ahead. The journey to Lagos took 8 hours, during which Adunni witnessed a Nigeria she had only heard about in stories. Massive cities that sprawled the horizon, highways filled with more vehicles than she had ever imagined, and crowds of people living at a pace that made village life seem like slow motion. But through it all, her mother's drums kept beating their protective rhythm, and she knew that no matter how overwhelming the city might seem, she carried with her the wisdom and strength of generations of women who had faced their own impossible battles and emerged victorious. As the bus finally entered the outskirts of Lagos, Adunni whispered a prayer to her mother's spirit and prepared to fight for every vulnerable child in every small village across Nigeria. 6 months later, Adunni stood in the courtroom of a Lagos judge, watching as the last member of the kidnapping ring was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her testimony, supported by evidence gathered during her brave journey through government offices and police stations, had led to arrests that saved dozens of children and shut down a network that had terrorized rural communities for years. The ghostly drumbeats that had once warned her of danger now pulsed with triumph and satisfaction, her mother's spirit finally at peace knowing that justice had been served. But Adunni's work was far from over. Using the connections she had made in the city and the support of international organizations that had taken notice of her courage, she had established a network of protection that linked villages across Nigeria, training young women to recognize the signs of predators and providing them with resources to seek help. Her mother's gift of spiritual awareness had become a practical tool for saving lives, and the drumbeats that had once guided only her steps now seemed to echo across the country, warning and protecting countless daughters. On the anniversary of the festival attack, Adunni returned to Ajibamidil for a celebration of a different kind, a ceremony honoring the 3 girls who had been rescued and a network of safety that now protected their community. As she stood beneath the ancient Irako tree where village meetings had been held for generations, she felt her mother's presence one final time, the ghostly drums now beating a rhythm of completion and pride. Mama Agba, now recognized as a grandmother and national hero, placed a hand on Adunni's shoulder and smiled. "Your mother can rest now," she whispered. "Her daughter has become the guardian she always meant to be." And as if in agreement, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, carried with the faint, satisfied whispered drums that had finally beaten their last warning and could now sing only songs of protection and love.